Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/skepticsbibleproject.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptics Bible Project. Happy to be back with you again today. Ben, I'm back out on the streets of Manhattan. I hope that's okay. I think it worked out all right last time.
Yeah, it was great. Just watch your blood sugar.
Yeah, I know. I was just buying some pretzels. I'm not diabetic, by the way, for anyone wondering. I was just telling Ben I haven't eaten today, and I feel like I'm going to pass out. So that could be like, a fun part of the show if that happens.
If you hear John's microphone rattling, it's probably not a special effect.
I don't even know anymore. What number episode are we in this Joe Rogan experience?
Episode 3474 of the Joe Rogan experience. They did 3 hours. We're doing 35 hours.
I guess that's typically how it works, though. It's the commentary takes longer than the actual thing that you're talking about, but it is a little bit weird. This is just what me and Ben like to do. I hope you guys are enjoying it. We like to take a deep dive and just dissect the hell out of something. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. But we're going to get back to our normal short form episode soon. I think we're probably getting closer to the end here, but I'm not sure. We're just winging it at this point.
Don't worry, we'll be doing another Testify episode soon.
Sounds good.
Or maybe Josh McDowell part 58.
Or we could do another one on
Okay.
Mrs. Joel Olstein.
Yeah.
I don't remember her name. So.
I can't either. I feel like they've fallen off the map.
All I remember about that is the monkeys.
Yeah, that was classic. Classic.
Go back and check out that episode, guys, if you haven't heard it. You're in for a real treat.
You learn about anthropology and also animal life in the jungle and also Christianity. Okay, I'm going to start us up here again.
Let's do it.
We're going to create with quantum computers are going to be able to figure things out in a way that we can't. But at the end of the day, you have one miracle. You have the Big Bang. All of science agrees this happened. That is so much crazier than anything that any religion is proposing. That it's so interesting to me that we say we have echoes of the Big Bang. There's radio echoes. Yeah, but also, let's assume that there is actually a higher power that occasionally interacts with human beings. And if a miracle did take place and you were there, you don't have a camera, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a pen, you can't write things down, maybe you can't even read. And you have this thing that happens to you, and this thing changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, the ideology that these people subscribe to, and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That in itself Even if this is just a revelation without a divine interaction, that's a fucking miracle.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all. Like the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of, was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah. That's
I mean, what is Joe even talking about? He started talking about,
It was a word salad. I was trying to follow it. It was hard for me to follow.
like, is he talking about the creation of the universe being the one miracle? Then, like, the creation of Christianity itself is
Yeah.
the one miracle. And if you were there to witness it and had a pen to write stuff down, it's very hard to follow what he's trying to say here. But I don't think that it makes more sense for it to be a miracle than some sort of a scientific explanation for the beginning of the universe. And again, he's looking backwards with all the theological lenses on. And the reality of Christianity is the main focus wasn't the supernatural. The supernatural was part of the apocalypse that was going to happen at the end of time. And Jesus was the first of the resurrected of the apocalypse at the end of time. So it's about the coming kingdom. It's about the end of Rome. It's about the crowning of a new king. It's supernatural in that sense. The miracle of the resurrection arose more out of the problem of the crucifixion. The crucifixion was a problem for Jesus being Messiah, or the end coming and taking down Rome. And so the way that that problem was solved was by the resurrection. So he's looking at it like, oh, all these miracles were the launch of Christianity. In reality, that's just not the case. Paul's not talking about miracles when he's writing his letters to the early churches. The miraculous, aside from the resurrection, the miraculous is something that's, like, I think is added on later.
Yeah, and if you're talking about just like improbable things, everything is improbable. Like you could say anything is a miracle. But getting back to the cosmological argument, which is really what Joe Rogan is talking about at the beginning when he's saying, like, the miracle of everything beginning from nothing kind of thing. How did everything begin? Wes Huff, you can tell, lights up at this because every Christian loves to talk about it, because it is the great unknown that science and philosophy has yet to come up with a comprehensive answer for. How does time exist and how did it all start? And these are very deep questions. But if you're coming back to that, just want to remind everybody that's the beginning arguments for every single culture on earth throughout history, asking that question. It doesn't get you any closer to Christianity. It doesn't get you to the New Testament, all the stuff that Wes Huff believes in. It gives you an easy answer, being theism, God. There must be some kind of intelligent force out there doing this, which is basically the first answer that humanity ever came up with. And it doesn't really move the bar beyond that in any way.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And again, this conflation that happens all the time with Christian apologists between evolution and the beginning of the universe and abiogenesis, and then abiogenesis and survival of the fittest or natural selection. Those things are all sort of their own thing. And to conflate them together it's like Christianizing the scientific narrative. It wasn't just a bang and then all of a sudden Adam was here.
Right.
It was a bang and then a long time went on before anything was really formed the way that we think of it as. And it took a massive amount of catastrophes in cosmology to even get to that point. The disasters that took to birth the universe and collisions and all kinds of craziness. And then when you get to Earth itself, however life starts, that's even different than once life starts, how life is developing and evolving and the selection process that's happening and what traits get passed on and mutations. That's part of natural reproduction. And so it is sort of confusing. The only other thing that I wanted to say was I think it's kind of funny that Joe is like, we have this proof of the Big Bang, electromagnetic pulses that prove it, and he sort of scoffs at that as if that's something that we we shouldn't have confidence in, but then we should have confidence in the miraculous beginning of the universe being some sort of meaningful event. So again, the skepticism is going in the wrong direction. I think he needs to have a little more skepticism towards the miraculous account and less skepticism about what science actually tells us happened.
Right.
You just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later. Pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples, they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead, we're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years, because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So I think that Wes is just wrong about this. And it's sort of what I just said. The miracle of being raised from the dead was something that was a pretty common trope, even in Roman literature. And the idea of resurrection from the dead is something that already was existent in Judaism and in Second Temple Judaism and amongst the Pharisees that Jesus talked to. So there was a belief that people were going to be raised from the dead at the end, and a belief that there was going to be a messianic king that was going to throw off the shackles of Rome. Jesus, in whatever way, was identified with this messianic figure. I definitely don't think he claimed to be God, so I disagree with that. But I think he was either identified by his followers or claimed to be this messianic king.
Yeah, but ultimately what you're saying is Wes Huff is just assuming the historical truth of the Gospels.
Well, and I think it creates really big problems because, again, we said this, I think, in the last episode.
We don't know what Jesus said.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. We don't know what he actually said. Most scholars would say he absolutely did not say everything that is attributed to him in the New Testament and outside of it. So then it becomes just an exercise in trying to get down to the historical Jesus, which is what everyone has been trying to do. But what Wes does, he comes on here like he's some kind of scholar and expert, but just assumes it's all historically accurate, which is not what anyone really believes other than the most fundamental people.
Yeah, and I think it's a problem in that the stories themselves don't make sense. If what he's saying is true, if Jesus did all these miracles and claimed to be God and predicted his own death and resurrection, then why did the disciples think the movement was over?
Right.
They should have been expecting this. They should have said, oh, this is exactly what he said numerous times. He's going to rise again in 3 days. Let's go to the tomb and look for him. But instead, that's not what happens in the story. In the story, they're like not going to the tomb at all. They run away scared. They doubt the women when they come with their story. These are the accounts that we have. So something doesn't make sense. Logically, it doesn't make sense. If you're seeing someone do miracles, claim to be God's son, and claim to be the Messiah, and claim to be God, and say that he's going to die and rise from the dead, and then he dies, where you just lose hope in all that aspiration, that doesn't make sense. So what I think is, again, these authors are looking backward, and they're creating the story that shows a theological purpose. Because Jesus, quote-unquote, rose from the dead, Jesus predicted that he would die and rise. He had that planned all along.
Right.
And this is also a way to get away from the embarrassment of the crucifixion. If Jesus is giving himself over to be crucified, it's a little less embarrassing than if he's just captured by Rome suddenly, unexpectedly, and put to death.
Right.
It's all part of his plan. By Luke, Jesus is calm, cool, and collected when he's going to his crucifixion because he already knows it's all finished. He's doing his Father's purpose. In Mark, he's not calm, cool, and collected. He's kind of stressed.
let me just back up for a second and explain, and maybe you can chime in too. Why would it be so embarrassing for Jesus to die on the cross? Because we think of it in Christianity today. That's not embarrassing. That's what Jesus does. He dies for our sins. But the expectation at the time of a messianic figure, hold on, I got pigeons flying in my face and crap. There's like a flock of pigeons that just like flew up right in my face as I was saying this. The crucifixion is embarrassing because that's not what the Messiah was supposed to do. The Messiah was supposed to conquer Rome and bring back the glory of Israel. And the way that it was foreseen in the Old Testament and talks about in an actual messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. And dying on the cross is not at all what anybody would have thought the Messiah was supposed to do. So for that reason, everyone's saying Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah, and then he dies on the cross. That's embarrassing because obviously he wasn't the Messiah.
Yeah, and in the Greco-Roman world, crucifixion was not even a word that would be spoken in polite society because it was so shameful. It was the way criminals were killed. People were not respected that were crucified. And again, we think, oh, he's crucified for our sins. He took sins. That's not what was happening. In the actual event, he was being crucified, a dissenter against Rome. And even that shows up in our stories. Like it says, King of the Jews.
Right.
So it's important to remember, yeah, what John said is totally correct. Wes is assuming that the Gospels are telling us an accurate reflection of what Jesus actually said, which is definitely not true. But also, these specific instances that he's bringing up are the things that are the most clearly contested historical statements of Jesus. Like almost no one thinks these are things that he actually said in real life.
Right. Of the things that even people like Bart Ehrman will say, some of what Jesus actually said is in the Bible. I don't know what I feel about that, but a lot of scholars will say, yes, there is historical truth in the Bible, and then we just have to kind of get out what it actually is. But the things that Wes Huff's talking about here, they're not what those people actually think Jesus really said. Because they're obviously the things that were written after the fact, as Ben already articulated.
Yeah, it's sort of like when Oliver Stone in JFK can look back on the Kennedy administration that ended tragically and imagine all this stuff that would have happened. He's imagining back into history.
Right. And we all do that.
Yeah.
I just want to say, again, we've said this in previous episodes, but Joe Rogan is really enamored with this Isaiah idea. And that he doesn't even understand what the point of that is, and that it's not nearly as miraculous as he thinks. But he's really taken by this. He's come back to it now how many times?
Yeah, it's so frustrating. And I really curse Wes Huff for not correcting this at all because it's just a blatant mistake of how you conceptualize the way these texts were passed on. So he's confusing Isaiah with the stories in the gospel. And imagine this oral tradition that's passing along Isaiah, which is not how Isaiah was passed along. It wasn't passed along through oral tradition. It was actually scribes. I mean, originally it was probably said by, if there was a prophet Isaiah, which he probably was historical, some of the stuff might have been based on the actual prophet Isaiah said. The form of the book of Isaiah that we have, or the 3 books of Isaiah that we have been passed along through copying. Like it wasn't oral tradition. It wasn't someone like memorizing it and I'm the book of Isaiah.
What you could say is like ancient Jewish scribes did an amazing job copying their literature. That's true, but that's not what Joe Rogan is amazed by. Joe Rogan thinks it was like a game of telephone, and it ended up with this thing that was unchanging. And Wes Huff is allowing Joe Rogan to have that false view because Joe Rogan is closer to thinking of a Christian miracle because of it. And this is what I'm talking about as far as the integrity of apologists like Wes Huff that are not really being truthful here. He could be like, well, that miraculous thing, it's not quite as miraculous as you think. Really, what it was, trained professional scribes that did this against part of the religion for centuries, millennia, whatever, to copy these texts and get it right. That is amazing in its own right. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the miracle that Wes Huff is allowing Joe Rogan to believe in.
And as we've said before, they didn't actually get it right.
Right.
They made a bunch of mistakes.
Yeah.
There's variations from other copies of Isaiah that are contemporaneous, even that were found in the same case.
Yeah.
So spare me with this whole nonsense. Like, it was copied and there were mistakes made. So that's just the fact.
Also, there's something, you hear this also when it comes to the New Testament, when Christians try to defend it and talk about how, oh, there's so few variations, even though there actually are a lot of variations between the texts. And they'll say, but it's a miracle because the text align like 90 something percent of the time. Well, if it was a miracle, wouldn't it be 100%? They're basically saying God is really good at this, but yeah, it's not perfect.
He's not going to hit every shot.
I mean, seriously, that's why we have, to this day, contradictions in the Bible that Christians have no idea how to answer. And Christians are like, yeah, they'll try and they'll come up with this and that. But the reason it's a problem is because we actually don't know what the original author said. Like Bart Ehrman says all the time, if God did the miracle of writing the text, of inspiring the text, why didn't he do the miracle of preserving the text and having it transmitted down? And they would say, well, he did, but it's like 90% good. It's 95% accurate. You go, okay, so God did the 95% miracle here? That almost, I don't know. Cuts against the wind is blowing right in my face. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it was a little bit windy for a second, but I heard.
Okay.
James White sort of ridiculed the Ehrman position. Like, what does he want him to do? Like, control every scribe's hand so they do it perfectly? I'm like, well, how did he write the text? Did he control the author's hand then?
We're not talking about the writing of the text. We're talking about
even just the copying of the text. If God wants to preserve his word perfectly throughout history, he could just do it. He could just make sure it's always preserved, instrumentally taking over the person that's doing the copying. But that's not what we see.
I mean, he could have gold tablets drop out of the sky too. He could do anything, right?
Yeah, or like you said, if he's able to do that, but only to like a 99%, like if he's protecting the text at all, then he should just protect it at 100%. And if he's not protecting it at all, then why are we using that as some sort of a metric to gauge something divine that's happening? It's just the scribes were good at copying.
Hold on, I had a good point, and then it like flew out of my head. Maybe it was like pigeons. As a skeptic, what I'm looking for is evidence of the supernatural, evidence of the divine. And if you're telling me, look, this was really well preserved, but not perfectly, to me, that's not evidence of the divine, of a miracle. That's just humans copying it, and then we could argue about how good or bad it is. And you have people on both sides arguing. In fact, Muslims will argue, yeah, this is a problem with the New Testament because it's not perfectly preserved. And they'll talk about how the Quran is perfectly preserved. Word for word, there's no problems whatsoever. And I don't know anything about that subject, so I can't comment on the validity of that. Maybe I should study it. But within Christianity, I can tell you, it's not perfectly preserved, so there's no evidence of a miracle happening there. So you're just left with a bunch of people wrote this stuff a long time ago, and then we can dig in like we're doing on this show. But again, where is the evidence of a miracle?
By the time canonization happens, is it even the same mark that was originally written? Or at that point, does it have extra endings added on? It's a much more complicated process than just saying the text was once and for all delivered and preserved closely.
No, I mean, you make a really good point because we're only talking about with what's extant, what we have. And what we have comes mostly from much later copies, right? And we have almost no access to anything from the first century in the time that it was actually written, which, by the way, scholars will tell you that's when most of the variations are found. That's when most of the earlier you go, the more problems you have because it wasn't all ironed out, which means the very earliest stuff we just have no access to at all. To me, that says, yeah, we don't know what the original Mark actually looked like. We have no idea.
It's kind of crazy, too, because even in the uncontested part of Mark, in our earliest copies, we have crazy textual variants. Who were the witnesses at the tomb, at the resurrection in Mark? It's like, well, our 4 or 5 earliest copies are all different. Mary, the mother of 2 different people.
Salome and the other Mary and Martha and
It's just very sloppy, and like for Wes to just trick Joe Rogan and then continue to just let him repeat over and over again.
yeah,
They were just passing it along orally. This guy remembered this for so long. Like, no, Isaiah's in 3 different parts. Like, Isaiah's not even one book.
right.
But like, it's not like Fahrenheit 451. No one was memorizing a whole book and walking around like, I'm Jeremiah. That's just not the way that it happened.
Right.
And the Gospels, it's even worse. This is what Wes would like to imagine, but you don't have like Peter talking to Mark and telling him the whole story. Like what you really have is someone heard a bunch of stories,
Right.
and is now incorporating those oral traditions into their narrative. That's best case scenario.
That's best case scenario because it really could be a wealthy patron commissioning somebody to say, hey, I want you to write me the gospel narrative. Like go out and construct it or research it. Like we don't know.
Like, I'm a wealthy patron, we'll just call me Theophilus. And I'm going to hire you, we'll call you Luke.
From Luke.
I've seen some of the other Gospels. I'm not impressed. I want you to write me the definitive account based on eyewitness testimony. You're not an eyewitness yourself. You admit it. This is actually closer to what we have. Like, we have a book commissioned by someone and written by an author to set the record straight in Luke. We don't have the testimony of Peter in Mark. We just have a gospel in Mark.
Well, what we have is 4 canonical gospels. So let's narrow it down to those. We won't talk about Thomas. Of the 4 that are actually in the Bible, 2 of them talk about why they were constructed and who constructed it. One of them is John, and John basically says, this is the testimony of the beloved disciple who has later been identified as John, but we don't know who it actually was. And we have every reason to believe him. So it means the person actually authoring the book is not the beloved disciple. It's saying the information I got, the testimony comes from that person. And it's hinted at that the beloved disciple is dead already when the book is written. There's good reason to think that because talks about Jesus saying that the beloved disciple will not die, but that's not actually what he meant. He said, what is it to you if I will that he doesn't die? So anyway, long story short, a lot of reasons to think John was the latest gospel. It probably has the least relevance to what actually happened historically. And then the other one that says anything is exactly what Ben just said, Luke, which says at the beginning, hey, Theophilus, the guy that's commissioning me, the guy that is hiring me to write this book, I've looked at all the other gospels and I'm not satisfied with their accuracy. And of course, when Luke was written, there was only, as far as we know, 1 or 2 other gospels, that being Mark and Q, maybe Matthew. So I'm going to write an orderly account of all that happened. So anyway, Luke, not an eyewitness, not claiming to be an eyewitness. Christians now will say, oh, well, we think he was Paul's physician, which comes from Acts, and that's a complicated thing that they derive. Never does it say anything like that. So they're just inventing it because they're uncomfortable with this idea that it's not coming from an eyewitness. So those are the 2. And then the problem with Luke is that we know that Luke is using word for word almost all of Mark. So when he says, "Oh, I went and interviewed eyewitnesses," it seems more likely that he just took Mark and rewrote it. And then there are parts that are unique to Luke, and perhaps he interviewed people to get that information. We don't know. Those are the birth narrative and the resurrection narratives that are unique to Luke. So then you're left with Mark and Matthew. Well, Matthew doesn't say anything about the authorship at all, about who wrote it and why they wrote it. And the same as Mark. Mark doesn't either. But what we know is that just like Luke, Matthew contains almost all of Mark within it. So again, if you're looking historically, you would go to Mark. You wouldn't go to Matthew, you wouldn't go to Luke, because Matthew and Luke are taking Mark and then altering it and changing and adding things for whatever reason, whatever their theological purpose is. So when we talk about what we can learn from the historical Jesus, scholars rarely use much information at all from Matthew, Luke, and John. They use a lot from Mark, though, because Mark is the most plausible pathway to get to the historical Jesus. Mark. Again, Mark doesn't say anything about who wrote it. It doesn't say I'm an eyewitness. It doesn't say I'm a follower of Peter. It doesn't say anything like that. It just very plainly lays out the story in a very non-embellished, non-over-the-top way. You don't have a lot of the miracles. You don't have the earthquake. You don't have the zombie apocalypse at the crucifixion and resurrection. You have no birth narratives, nothing about the virgin birth. And you have no resurrection appearances. Anyway, are you still with me, Ben?
Yeah.
So long story short, we've probably talked about this a million times on this show, but I think it's important when we're talking about this stuff with Wes Huff to understand what's going on here. Wes Huff is really putting a lot more historical credibility on all of these gospels than there really is.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's always just assumed that you have these reliable accounts.
Right.
You would never get to the point where they're talking about the gospel authors.
I don't know about you, Ben, but growing up in church, I thought Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John were just 4 of the 12 apostles.
I assumed that the gospels were trustworthy and that they were written by eyewitnesses. I remembered that being told to me like a million times.
But again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I would have thought, my guess is if you polled most people in church, they would have said, yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were 4 of the 12 apostles. In reality, of those names, Matthew and John were the only ones that could be considered part of the 12. Because Luke is who knows, Mark is who knows. Matthew, a follower of Jesus, almost certainly didn't write Matthew. The book, there's no reason to think that. And Luke was not either. So anyway.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting, even though Mark is a more simple Greek, Mark has Aramaic words in his gospel, and he also has Latin words in his gospel, which makes it seem like he's probably not from Galilee.
Interesting.
If he knows Greek, some Latin, and some Aramaic, that seems like someone relatively educated, even if he's an enslaved scribe, and educated scribes. And then the other thing that I was going to say, it's just extremely dubious. All of this tying of the Gospels to eyewitnesses, there was such a push when the canonization was happening, because you had other Gospels. Marcion was creating his Gospel. You had these other sort of Gnostic texts that were arising and creating problems in the church. And there was a real push to tie these 4 that were the most received Gospels to eyewitness testimony. And I think the names were probably attached around then, or if the names were attached already, the names were sort of used to make precarious attachments to people like Luke the physician or Matthew as Levi, because that's really problematic. There was a real ideological reason to attach these Gospels to eyewitness testimony, but it doesn't stand the historical smell test.
Yeah, you see that tradition with the names happening outside the canonical Gospels also, where they take prominent names, or even just a name that's like mentioned somewhere in the New Testament, all of a sudden he gets his own gospel or he becomes a prominent figure for whatever reason. And that tradition may have been happening at the earliest writings, which is why, Matthew got titled Matthew.
Yeah, Matthew, Bartholomew.
Yeah, I think that tradition continues as far as the names is my point.
Part of what apologists say all the time is, why would they attach a gospel to Mark? Who's Mark?
Right.
Like you said, by the time you get later on, gospels are getting attached to like very minor figures. Or they're creating other characters to have like the acts of Thecla. And so I don't think that is a very convincing argument, but the fact that they were attaching gospels to people's names, and then these gospels got attached in this like weird, oh, well, we know the gospel of Luke because Luke was a traveler of Paul, and so Luke got the gospel from Paul. Like, that doesn't even make sense. Oh, but Luke also knew Peter, so maybe he was... What's even the plot? Like, how's this supposed to work?
Yeah.
It's all just very nebulous and doesn't really seem historical.
I actually think, though, that to give credit, at least that's an argument that makes a little bit more sense when they say, oh, if you were going to invent this gospel and come up with a name, you would say John or Peter. You wouldn't say Mark. That's a good argument, I think. My belief is that there probably was a Mark that wrote a gospel. We have reference to this from Papias. So it seems like there probably was a guy named Mark that wrote a gospel. We don't know, though, that the Mark that we have is the Mark that they're referencing when they talk about that. And there's actually some reason to doubt that, partially because the way Papias talks about the Gospel of Mark is not at all like the version of Mark that we have. But, I mean, it doesn't really get you anywhere. If you say a guy named Mark wrote a gospel that wasn't a follower of Jesus, okay. I don't understand. That wouldn't mean anything to me, right?
You could make an argument that these names actually come before the association. Like that this gospel was called Matthew, and so they were like, because people will say, oh, Matthew has references to coinage.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a tax collector, right? He knows coins.
Oh, I see. Because no one else knew coinage other than the actual coin collectors.
It's Levi, right? Is the tax collector in the gospel?
Yes.
So it's like, well, Matthew's actually Levi, even though it doesn't say that anywhere.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting. I thought it did say that, but I thought one gospel calls him Matthew and one calls him Levi.
I think that's where they make the assumption. They're like, oh, well, it must be talking about the same person because the name's different, right?
It's so frustrating because you're also dealing with Christian translators who have translated the Bible itself. So they might just call him Matthew, even though in the original text it literally said Levi. But they're like, whoa, we know.
And what's the tradition with Mark? Well, Mark, yeah, it's just a guy named Mark, but he also just happened to be the scribe of Peter.
Right.
So he's attached to Peter. So they are still attaching it. They wouldn't make up the name Mark. Well, maybe the name Mark was there, but they definitely had a reason to attach Mark to Peter. That's what you're really saying Mark's authority is coming from.
Right. I'm not saying this is accurate, but I don't even have a problem saying that Mark was a follower of Peter. I think there really was a Peter, and he probably had followers. And why is it crazy to have Mark, after Peter's death, write down what he's saying Peter said? I don't think any of this is a problem for the skeptics' position. I'm saying, like, even if you grant the best case scenario for what they're trying to say, yeah, I believe people really believe that this stuff is true. So I don't understand where any of this is really getting us.
So you heard it here first, folks. John says he thinks Papias is historically reliable. He says the Papias tradition is true.
I always try to say, even if I grant like the most generous view to the Christian's point of view, to the conservative point of view, if we found out that Peter himself wrote Mark, where does that really get you? I've said this ad nauseum on this show, but to this day, we have eyewitnesses that are alive now that will tell you about Bigfoot and being abducted by aliens, and and no one believes that, or very few people believe it's true. Maybe you do. Even if you grant that these things are all historically accurate, written by eyewitnesses, which I, of course, am not granting that if anyone's listening to this show, but it still doesn't get you any closer to like actually believing the things that are being said.
Ultimately, the skeptic's position is the problem is pretending these things are knowable one way or the other, because we really don't know.
Right.
The traditions that we have seem dubious. There's reasons to think that Papias is not talking about the same mark that we have. When the church fathers are talking about the Gospels, that the way they describe them don't match with what we have in our Gospels today. Like Matthew was not originally in Hebrew.
Right.
It doesn't look like Matthew and Mark have a different order of events, or that Mark is only recording the words of Jesus. That's clearly not. Mark has very little of the words of Jesus.
But I'm trying to get you I mean, all of that is true. And that's the stuff we've talked on this show forever. I'm just trying to say to you, I'm interested in your thoughts. When we were growing up in high school, Pastor Cantor, he's a pastor, a friend of ours, dad, he told me about miraculous accounts that happened in front of him in church. He witnessed, and this is a guy we liked and we trusted and respected. He's a really cool guy.
An ER doctor, so not like new science.
Yeah, he's a doctor. People are going to go look him up now because we give too much information.
Dr. Robert Cantor, Merrick, New York.
All right, we're going to have to edit. Just put, when you're editing, just put like a beep like over the name, like a...
It'll be like in Kill Bill Volume 1.
Right. Anyway, he told us about these miracles that happened in front of him. And you know what? I didn't believe him at the time. So even if I grant everything that the apologists say about the authorship of the Gospels, why am I going to believe it?
That's the overall question that you have to ask yourself is, what criteria can we use to gauge this miraculous account that has 2,000 years of staying power versus like any other account of the miraculous has just happened to not catch on in history? Because there's no good criteria. Like, we shouldn't, just because you have eyewitness testimony about a miracle doesn't mean that miracle took place. I don't think that Mary appeared in Mexico in the sky. I mean, I think maybe people thought that they saw that, but I don't think that that actually happened.
Well, I'll put it this way. Yeah, I'm not necessarily claiming people are lying. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But here's my point. When you said sometimes eyewitnesses are wrong, when we're talking about the miraculous, 100% of the time, they've always been wrong. They've always been wrong 100% of the time. There's no verified factual evidence of a miracle anywhere. So again, why am I going to believe, even from an eyewitness standpoint, it's dubious on many, many levels. In fact, to the point where it's almost impossible to believe the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses. They're not claiming that, blah, 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 on and on and on. But even if you grant that, like I'm saying, I'm still not really sure where that gets you.
Yeah, it's funny. This is a little bit off topic, but sort of related. You know, we talked before about how Christianity sort of has this incessant need to be, like, they act like they don't want to be accepted by the culture, but they actually do perform for the culture and want to be respected intellectually. And you see a whole theology built around that called cessationalist theology that basically says there's no more miracles anymore. And the reason that theology developed is because there were no miracles. And people didn't want to look like idiots. And so they developed a theology that says, no,
Right.
God did miracles at one point in time, and he doesn't do miracles anymore
Right.
because the age of the apostles is over. That's nowhere in the Bible. So, but that's the reality. They would laugh at the Pentecostals.
I mean, that's basically what I grew up with, Ben. I don't know about you, but
We would laugh at them like they're so dumb. They think this stuff is still going to happen. God doesn't work that way anymore. We all know that. Like, he was doing that at that specific time. But that's not theology that's really found in the Bible. That's not the way Paul describes when you have the Spirit. He basically says you can do magic.
yeah, and he's even talking to his congregation going forward, saying that you will be able to do these things too. God is going to give you these gifts. It never says, by the way, once this book is published, that is going to be all stopped. Or after I'm dead, because I'm the last apostle. It doesn't say anything like that. In fact, there's no reason to think that he means that.
And we have books written long after Paul that are still like fully engrossed in the supernatural and the miraculous. Like Revelation than like the Gospels.
Yeah, and the Catholic Church throughout the centuries claims miracles, to this day.
Yeah, and the Orthodox Church too. They just do it in a way that sort of shields them from the criticism that they're just being superstitious, even though it's just as nebulous.
I mean, we're like so far afield from what we were with Wes Huff. I just want to say one other thing that is very relevant to this. I had a pastor tell me that even prayer, you shouldn't actually expect anything to come from it at all because God doesn't work that way anymore. And I was like, well, then why should we pray? And well, because you're commanded to. It's just an exercise in just doing what you're told, basically. But nothing will happen because there is no supernatural intercession happening anymore, which at least is kind of honest, refreshing thing. But it's not the view that most Christians have. Most Christians absolutely expect some sort of a change based on their prayer.
And again, I'll bring this up other times because it's sort of an idea that I'm bouncing around in my head, but there's so many things that just arise sort of out of a historical contingency dealing with, like, you deal with the problem of evil, God doesn't answer prayer, and so you have to make sense out of that theologically, and so it becomes all these different reasons. Well, we live in a determined universe, and everything works together for good, and God has an overall plan, and he's planned since the beginning, and that's how he's brought about the salvation of the people that he's brought about. And so my prayers are an act of discipline, but also giving in to his divine sovereign plan and trusting that his plan is right. And it's all just coping because a person you love died when you prayed for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see those theologies dealing with the problem of evil happening even in the Bible. Like Bart Ehrman has a whole book about it, the problem of suffering and the different ways the Bible answers the problem of suffering. So
people are going to think we're Bart Ehrman fanboys because we bring him up all the time.
Yeah, we're definitely not Bart Ehrman fanboys. No, we kind of are, though.
My defense for that would be, if you listen to the show, you know that we are familiar with many scholars. We bring up Bart Ehrman a lot because he's the one that people know. Like he's kind of popularized the idea of textual criticism in a broader sense. So we bring him up because it's a good, easy reference that people will understand the type of thought process that we're talking about when we describe him.
In the apologetic world, they know Bart Ehrman at least. It's sort of this inoculation, but they also don't know any other scholars. We'll try to introduce you to other scholars as well, but Ehrman is a good barometer for biblical scholarship in general because he's pretty reserved and conservative, and he doesn't change wildly into crazy positions that are radical. For the most part, he follows the consensus, and I mean, I think his views are more conservative than my view.
But also we're huge fanboys.
Yeah, we also love and worship him. The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.